Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into the Vikings' insane tolerance for cold and their weirdly creative ways to suffer through it. These folks somehow survived Scandinavian winters without central heating, so before you get all cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you actually like what I'm doing here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fun to see who's tuning in from all corners of the globe. Now, dim those lights. Feel free to turn on a fan for white noise or fire up a heater if you want to cheat on historical accuracy. Let's embark on tonight's journey together. When temperatures outside dropped to unbearable levels, the Vikings didn't freak out. Nope, they just retreated inside. Their longhouses big, low, and only slightly less airtight than a modern sauna built inside a cow barn. These longhouses were basically the Viking version of a winter bunker, mostly built from wood if you lived near trees, or turf and stone if you didn't. They hugged the ground to trap heat and were roomy enough to fit multiple families and sometimes a strategic few cows, because nothing screams comfort like sleeping next to something that chews cud and farts. The key to surviving the cold was shared warmth. Picture the longhouse as one giant communal heat source, human bodies, animals, and a fire pit all working together in cozy harmony. With zero ventilation, it was more home than survival bunker. The fireplace ran down the center of the longhouse, doubling as both stove and heater. No chimney here. Chimneys hadn't been invented yet. Or more accurately, they were invented but absent in places where people still used bones to block their doors. Instead, the smoke rose and gathered on the beams, occasionally escaping through a hole in the roof or just hanging out, turning the entire ceiling black and everyone's lungs into wool-lined ashtrays. From a modern perspective, Viking houses look suffocating, cramped, and downright weirdly cozy, and, spoiler alert, they really were. But for Vikings, it was the best option besides becoming a snow sculpture. Raised sleeping platforms lined the walls, usually stuffed with straw, moss, or whatever soft and flammable stuff they could find. Families, and sometimes their goats, all slept together, not because they were super close, but because warmth wasn't optional and privacy hadn't been invented yet. Basically, Viking longhouses were uncomfortable but effective. They kept people alive through brutal winters. Even if they didn't keep them smelling fresh or well-rested, Viking fashion wasn't about looking cool. It was about not freezing before breakfast. If there's one thing North Europeans understood better than raiding, it was layering. And not just scarves and gloves, we're talking full-body wool armor, reinforced with fur, leather, and zero shame. The lining was linen. If you were lucky enough to have some, linen's light, breathable, and wicks sweat. Unfortunately, it tears easily and is expensive to make, so most people skipped it. Lots and lots of wool. Viking men wore long shirts over, leg wraps, basically ancient thermal leggings. Women wore long woolen dresses with multiple layers of aprons and cloaks. Everyone belted their stuff tight and carried pouches for essentials, knives, flintstones, or maybe an emergency cheese wedge. Cloaks were a must-have. pinned with brooches, sometimes trimmed with fur. And if you didn't have a brooch, well, you probably didn't have much time left anyway. Shoes were made from animal hides, usually cattle or seal, and waterproofed with layers of grease. Viking shoes weren't pretty, but they were sealed with fat and windproof. The only downside, they reeked like a jerky factory for the truly dedicated. Intestines were sometimes used as waterproof layers. Yep, animal guts, cleaned, scraped, dried, and sewn. Animal skins, usually cattle or seal hides, waterproofed with a generous slathering of fat. Viking shoes, not exactly runway material, but hey, they were sealed tight with grease and windproof. The only downside, they smelled like a jerky factory exploded for the truly dedicated. Intestines sometimes doubled as waterproof layers. Yep, actual animal guts, cleaned, scraped, dried, and stitched into a sort of raincoat prototype. Not exactly breathable, but snow and rain, no problem, and nobody batted an eye at. Your outfit being wrapped up in layers upon layers, hats, gloves, scarves, all standard issue, usually made from felted wool. That's wool beaten so much it loses its structure and turns into a cozy, dense mat. No gloves, just shove your hands into your cloak and pray no one notices your fingers. Turning blue when it came to surviving the freezing Scandinavian nights. Vikings had one food rule: eat like your life depends on it because, spoiler, it does. Calories weren't a treat, they were insulation. Viking winter food wasn't fancy. It was rich, fatty, and aggressively practical. Let's start with the basics: meat, milk, grains, and preserved fish. Lots and lots of preserved fish. They smoked it, salted it, dried it, fermented it, and didn't apologize for any of it. Take lutefisk. For example, whitefish soaked in alkaline solution until it's got the texture and nutrition of something in between. Not tasty, but impressively resistant to going bad. For heartier meals, stew was king. Vikings tossed whatever they had into a pot over a fire: meats, veggies, oats, even yogurt. The longer it cooked, the better. It didn't win any beauty contests, but it stuck to your ribs and even your bowl. Milk was a staple year-round, but especially crucial in winter. Cheese and butter were made during warmer months and stored for the cold season, not your fancy creamy butter. Think hard, salty, wheel-shaped milk bricks for survival, perfect for chewing, trading, or chucking at wolves. They also made skyr, a kind of yogurt cheese hybrid, definitely the Viking version you'd eat and be grateful for. High in protein and ridiculously sour. This stuff is like a slap in the face, refreshing but confusing. Grains were stored in bulk. Barley and rye formed the base for flatbreads and porridges. Viking bread was dense, dark, and sometimes baked with crushed bark to stretch the dough further. Again, not delicious. But as long as your blood sugar stayed above freezing, mission accomplished. And finally, booze, beer, and mead weren't just party drinks. They packed calories, had mild antiseptic qualities, and made your numb toes feel deeply comforted. I especially love how they make you forget that you're living in a smoky barn with livestock and 6 relatives. And even if it tasted awful, Hey, at least no one's stealing your leftovers. When winter got brutal, which surprise, it always did in Scandinavia, Vikings turned to their most reliable heat source, other mammals. Bringing animals inside wasn't weird back then. It was considered smart. Chickens, pigs, sheep, goats, even cattle were invited into the Viking longhouse, not for cuddles, but to keep bodies warm. Think medieval central heating powered by mooing. Livestock were usually kept in a part of the longhouse called the byre, basically a garage that doubled as a stable. A low dividing wall kept animals and humans close, but not too close. And by not too close, I mean close enough to smell, but not close enough to pet without consequences. On freezing nights, that line blurred. Families could huddle near the byre. Kids napped next to a sheep. If the ox was warm and cooperative, congratulations. That's your pillow right there. Not comfy, but undeniably effective. The logic was simple: animals generate heat. A cow could emit as much warmth as a small campfire without the hassle of building one. In harsh conditions, that heat could mean the difference between waking up frostbitten or just annoyed by the pig's snoring. Of course, there were downsides. You had to deal with noise, smells, and occasional misplaced hoofbeats. But Vikings didn't complain. They grasped a universal truth: warmth first, dignity later. It wasn't just about heat. Keeping animals close protected them from theft, predators, and freezing to death outside. Livestock were family assets, food supplies, and heating systems all wrapped up in one rough bundle of hay. Often, the longhouses were designed. Low dividing walls brought animals and humans closer together, and by semi-permeable, we mean close enough to sniff each other, but not so close that you pet without consequences. On freezing nights, the boundaries blurred. Families might huddle near the butcher. Kids could nap next to a sheep. If the buffalo was warm and chill, congrats. That's your pillow. Not comfy. But hey, it works. The logic's simple. Animals generate heat. A cow can radiate as much warmth as a small campfire, no fire needed. In harsh conditions, that warmth might be the difference between waking up ice cold or just annoyed by the pig's snoring. Of course, side effects. Not great. Noise, stink, and occasional misplaced horse hooves. But Vikings didn't complain. They got the universal truth: warmth first, dignity later. It wasn't just about heat. Keeping animals close protected them from thieves, predators, and freezing to death outside. Livestock was family fortune, food source, and a heating system, all bundled in a clumpy hay package. Often, longhouses were designed with this in mind. Builders deliberately transferred warmth from livestock to human quarters. First comes warmth, then comes dignity. It's not just about heat. Packing animals close together keeps them safe from thieves, predators, and freezing to death outside. Livestock was the family's assets, their food supply, and their heating system, all bundled up in a lumpy hay package. Often, longhouses were designed with this in mind. Builders deliberately passed the buyer's body heat into the dwelling. It was survival architecture, simple, effective, And with a nice rustic aroma, Vikings didn't just survive the cold, they endured it with a disturbingly cheerful attitude. When the fire sputtered, the goats got cranky, and the smoke turned your longhouse into a giant barbecue pit. You still had one last defense against the cold: each other. Cuddling wasn't just for warmth, it was community survival 101. Families slept, packed tight on raised platforms covered with wool and scraps of animal hide that weren't good enough to patch the roof. Privacy. That was a myth, so comfort was just a rumor. But warmth that was shared. Kids huddled between adults. The elders were treated like heated relics. Dogs and cats weren't pets. They were furry little heating devices. Everyone crammed together, breathing each other's smoky cabbage-scented breath and pretending not to hear Bjorn snoring like an injured moose. But this wasn't just physical survival. Winter isolation could rot your mind faster than your toes. That's when Viking humor kicked in rude, blunt, but oddly effective. They told legendary tales and sang songs, usually about frostbitten warriors dying heroically, which somehow made everyone feel better. They roasted each other with sharp wit and zero filter. Nothing beats seasonal depression like mocking your cousin for falling into the outhouse last week. Partying was also a key morale booster. Come midsummer, the autumn food stores were unloaded in bulk, not just to celebrate Yule, but to remind everyone, hey, we're still alive and look, we've got turnips. Vikings also held games and contests indoors, sometimes including riddles, board games like primitive chess but with more backstabbing, or wrestling matches that occasionally toppled livestock. The goal wasn't just fun, it was a distraction from the cold, so the darkness, and the very real chance that spring might never show up. But above all, they survived winter because they expected it to be brutal. No complaints, no chasing comfort. Misery was the default setting. Anything better was a bonus. Modern insulation materials like fiberglass, foam, or fancy branded high-tech stuff with warning labels. Vikings didn't get that luxury. Their insulation plan was simple stuff, as much nature into the walls as possible, and pray it stuck. Viking longhouses weren't just ramshackle huts by accident. You could say it was by design. These homes were built to trap heat using whatever materials were on hand: wood if you lived near a forest, grass and stone if you didn't, thick walls, sometimes up to a meter wide, aimed to keep warmth in by any means necessary. Between logs or stones, they jammed moss, straw, mud, or animal fur, anything fibrous, dense, and slightly warm-smelling got stuffed into every crack. Not exactly glamorous, and you probably wouldn't want to lean your bare feet against it. But it worked. Roofs were usually thatched with straw, or better yet, grass, sod roofs. This wasn't some hipster eco-trend. Sod roofs offered killer insulation, drained well, and under the right conditions. You might even get a wild weed or mushroom popping up. Indoor gardening, aka accidental salad bar. Floors were usually just packed earth, sometimes topped with a layer of straw or rushes, swapped out periodically. And by periodically, we mean whenever the smell got too unbearable to call rustic anymore. Windows were rare and tiny, And if they existed, well, they were just windows. Light came from fire or strategically placed smoke holes. Why no big fancy windows? Because glass was expensive. Drafts were deadly. And Vikings didn't care much for natural light when it was pitch black for 3 months straight. But this rushed wood, grass, and biomaterial mashup worked surprisingly well. It turned the longhouse into a slow cooker filled with body heat and goat breath, perfectly capable of surviving a Scandinavian winter. This wasn't a spa. It wasn't breathable. The hipster-approved eco-design trend, thatched roofs are awesome insulators, drain well, and if conditions are right, occasionally some weeds or mushrooms pop up. Indoor gardening, accidental salad bar style. Floors were usually just packed earth, sometimes covered with straw or rush mats, swapped out regularly. And by regularly, we mean whenever the stench stopped being rustic and started being just plain gross. Windows were super rare and tiny if they existed at all. They were barely windows. Light came from fire or strategically placed smoke holes. Why no big windows? Because glass was expensive. Drafts were deadly. And Vikings didn't really care about natural light when it was pitch black for 3 months straight. But this frantic gathering of wood, straw, and biomaterials actually worked surprisingly well. It turned a longhouse into a slow cooker of body heat and goat breath, totally capable of surviving a Scandinavian winter. This wasn't a spa. It wasn't exactly breathable, probably failed every modern building code out there, but it kept Viking families alive, warm, smoky enough to preserve food and keep bugs away. When the fire died down and the wind outside howled like an angry ice demon, Vikings relied on a tried-and-true survival method to get through the night. Sleep like your life depends on it, because it really does. The Viking bedroom setup wasn't about privacy. It was all about heat strategy. The whole family. Sometimes, but it worked. In theory. The smoke was supposed to rise and escape through the thatched roof or vents near the top, but in reality, the smoke clung to the beams like an uninvited guest, slowly seeping into everyone's lungs. You weren't breathing fresh air in a Viking house, you were breathing Viking air. By the end of a winter evening, your chest felt like you'd just smoked a pork shoulder, and the pork shoulder felt the same way. Weirdly, that wasn't totally bad. The smoke helped preserve the meat and fish hanging from the beams. It also kept bugs and mold away. Plus, constant low-level exposure probably gave every Viking respiratory system a Victorian coal miner vibe, including distant relatives and any sick livestock. Slept on raised wooden platforms running along the long walls of the house. These platforms were covered with straw, moss, or dried grass, then layered with fur, wool, and scraps of fabric. No fancy sheets, no blankets, no embroidered pillowcases. If it was soft and didn't bite, it went on the bed. Everyone slept fully clothed, changing into pajamas when it's below freezing. Great way to become a Viking popsicle. So, layer up. Sometimes people even slept with their boots on, if that sounds ridiculous. Remember, frostbite doesn't care about your dignity. Babies were tightly swaddled and held close. Kids usually sat between parents or older siblings, not for bonding. but purely for logistical isolation, basically. It was one big human and wool meatloaf, obviously. Couples slept together, but anyone who could squeeze in did. Modesty wasn't priority number one. Warmth was. Even if someone's feet wandered a bit. That's survival, not scandal. Wool cloaks were draped over bodies like medieval electric blankets. Animal hides, especially reindeer or bear skins, added extra warmth. If you had a rawhide blanket, you were either super rich, insanely lucky, or just really determined to hunt terrifying things in winter. In wealthy households, or during brutal winters, hot stones or bricks sometimes went under the bed. Yep, Vikings had their own version of a hot water bottle, just heavier and more likely to burn your thighs. And if the fire died out overnight, you weren't supposed to just relight it right away. You'd pull someone close and mutter something in Old Norse, probably meaning, "Don't steal my fur again." To sum up, sleeping in a Viking longhouse was anything but glamorous. It was smoky, cramped, and the snoring guaranteed 100%. But hey, it worked. In theory, smoke was supposed to rise and escape through the thatched roof or vents near the top, but in reality, it stuck to the beams like an uninvited guest and slowly seeped into everyone's lungs. You're not breathing fresh air in a Viking house. You're breathing Viking air by the end of a winter night. Your chest feels like you just smoked a pork shoulder, and so does the pork shoulder, weirdly. It's not all bad. Smoke preserved the meat and fish hanging from the beams. It also kept bugs and mold away. Plus, constant low-level exposure probably made every Viking's lungs Victorian coal miner level tough. Still, the downsides can't be ignored. Red eyes, dry coughs, and ceilings stained yellow, darker than Odin's mood. Kids and elders probably suffered the most, since they were shorter and closer to the thickest smoke layers. You know, because physics is weird like that. Some families tried to cope by building higher platforms or sleeping closer to the floor to dodge the smoke. Others just powered through, tears streaming while stirring stew or trying not to trip over a half-cooked goat. A few fancy Viking houses even had actual smoke vents in the roof. But for your average Norse family, smoke was just part of the vibe. It warmed you, seasoned your food, and reminded you daily that fire was both friend and deadly hazard. And if things got too smoky, you opened a door for fresh air and instantly got frostbite on your toes. When the darkest days of the year hit and the sun decided to take a month off, Vikings turned to an ancient, extremely effective survival tool: partying. You can't freeze to death if you're too busy drinking and shouting around the fire. But the downsides were hard to ignore. Red eyes, dry coughs, and ceilings stained a depressing yellow, darker than Odin's mood. Kids and elders probably suffered most, since they were shorter and closer to the thickest smoke layers. Physics is weird like that. Some families tried to cope by building raised platforms or sleeping closer to the floor to dodge the smoky haze. Others just powered through, tears streaming as they stirred stews or tried to find a bed without tripping over a half-cooked goat. A few high-end Viking houses even had real smoke vents on the roof. But for your average Norse family, smoke was just part of the atmosphere. It warmed you, seasoned your food, and reminded you daily that fire was both a lifesaver and a potential health hazard. And if the smoke got too thick, you'd open a door, breathe in fresh air, and promptly freeze your toes off. When the darkest days of the year hit and the sun decided to take a month off, Vikings turned to an ancient, brutally effective survival tool: partying. You can't freeze to death if you're too busy drinking and yelling around the fire. Ule appeared midwinter festival, staying close to the thickest smoke layers. Physics is weird like that. Some families tried to manage by building raised platforms or sleeping closer to the floor to dodge the smoke haze. Others just tough it out, tears streaming as they stirred stew or tried to find their bed without tripping over a roasting goat. A few fancy Viking homes had actual smoke vents in the roof, but for your average Norse family, smoke was just part of the atmosphere. It warmed you, seasoned your food, and reminded you daily that fire was both your best friend and a potential health hazard. And if the smoke got too much, open the door, let fresh air in, and freeze your feet off when the darkest days of the year hit and the sun decided to take a month off. Vikings turned to an ancient, super effective survival tool celebration. You can't freeze if you're too busy drinking and yelling around the fire. Ula showed up. The Midwinter Festival, that was part religious ritual, part survival tactic, and part excuse to eat anything not nailed down. The festival usually kicked off around the winter solstice and lasted for days, sometimes weeks. Depending on the honeymead supply, it wasn't just a party, it was a psychological lifesaver. Ule lifted spirits when morale was scraping frost off the floor. It gave folks something to look forward to besides not dying. Families gathered. Animals were sacrificed, for blessings and dinner. Huge fires were lit to symbolize the return, scratching frost-covered floors. It gave everyone something to look forward to besides not dying. Families gathered. Animals were sacrificed, to bless the party and maybe dinner. Huge fires were lit to symbolize the sun's comeback. Not your cute little campfires. These were raging bonfires, basically daring the night to show up. They ate preserved meat, drank beer and mead, told folk tales, played games, and sometimes, just sometimes, they sang, and not softly. Viking singing probably sounded like someone trying to seduce a thunderstorm with a battle cry. The Ula log, now a quirky dessert or centerpiece, was originally a log burning for days. It symbolized warmth, continuity, and not letting your family freeze their butts off. Practical and symbolic, very Viking. There was also some supernatural stuff. Winter was seen as when restless spirits, goblins, and ancestors roamed free, so rituals, charms, and offerings were made to keep the peace and hopefully convince those spirits not to steal your goats. And yes, a lot of modern Christmas traditions were borrowed from Ule: evergreens, partying, gift-giving, dragging dead trees indoors, all approved by the Norse crowd. But above all, Ule was about sticking together through the suck in a world with no light switches, no vitamin D pills, and no seasonal depression diagnoses. Vikings made joy from the little things with fire, food, and a solid belief that the cold would pass, because it always did, and when it didn't, at least you went home, stuffed, and with a story worth telling. Viking Age Scandinavia valued gold. Sure, silver was better, but wool was life. Not just a material wool was Vikings' main weapon against the cold. Right after fire and sometimes hugging a sheep, it was spun, woven, sewn, and layered into everything: cloaks, tunics, socks, gloves, underwear, and blankets. If it could be made from wool, it was. Simple reason: wool works. Unlike cotton, which clings like a traitorous cold, wet hug, wool keeps you warm even when damp, which is super handy when your local forecast is freezing fog with a side of regret. Every household, especially on farms, raised sheep, not for cuteness or cheese, but for that miraculous, itchy stuff growing on their backs. Spinning wool was a year-round work, usually done by women and kids. In winter, it was the closest thing to heating the future. Vikings didn't make fashion for fashion's sake, but their wool clothes were surprisingly tailored. Tunics fit just right, cloaks cut for easy movement, leg wraps stitched cleverly to avoid tripping in blizzards. Style met function, warmth met style. In fact, your wool quality said a lot about you. Coarse wool meant you were either poor or practical. Fine. Tightly woven wool, luxury, the Viking version of a cashmere hoodie. Rich Vikings could buy dyed wool, sometimes imported blues or reds. Everyone else rocked 37 shades of sheep. And don't forget felt wool, soaked, stomped, and rubbed into a windproof mat. Vikings used felt for hats, boots, gloves, and sometimes to insulate walls. It's like making fabric from rage and foot sweat. But it worked. Wool clothing was patched, repaired, and handed down. Nothing was wasted. Even wool scraps were woven into socks or stuffing. A good cloak could last generations, as long as it didn't catch fire, blow away, or get buried with you on your final outfit. Sounds ironic, but some folks who survived the coldest weather in history loved making themselves even colder. Yep, Vikings were big fans of saunas and ice baths. Because why just endure the cold when you can challenge it like a trophy? Viking steam tents, called badstofa, were little huts or pits made from stone. Felt became windproof rugs. Vikings used felt for hats, boots, gloves, and sometimes to insulate walls. It was basically fabric made from rage and foot sweat. But hey, it worked. Wool clothes got patched, repaired, and nothing goes to waste. Even the tiniest wool scraps get woven back into socks or stuffed into pillows. A good cloak could last through generations, as long as it didn't catch fire, get blown away, or get buried with you like part of your travel outfit. Sounds practical, but here's the kicker. Some folks who lived through the coldest weather in history actually liked making themselves even colder. Yep, Vikings were big fans of saunas and ice baths, because why just suffer the cold when you can dare it like a treasure? Viking saunas, called badstofa, were tiny huts or pits made from stone and grass, where hot rocks got doused with water to create steam. You'd sit inside, half naked, sweating like a mad warrior at a summer party. While outside the world was freezing solid, it was a hot, steamy, smoky break from the icy reality outside the door. Then, and here's the real fun part, some Vikings would run straight outside, jump into icy water, or roll in the snow voluntarily for their health. In other words, because they were trying to prove to the icy reality waiting just outside the door. Now here's the really fun part. Some Vikings would literally run outside and dive headfirst into ice-cold water or roll around in the snow on purpose for their health. In other words, they were trying to prove to themselves, the gods, and anyone watching that they were absolutely fearless, even of hypothermia. These hot and cold rituals weren't just for show, they actually made sense. Sweating helped cleanse the body, or at least made you feel like you were doing something about not showering for weeks. The brutal temperature swings also boosted circulation, cleared sinuses, and made you forget, just for a moment, that you lived in a world with zero insulation and no painkillers. They had a social side too. Saunas were community spaces where families or groups would sweat and freeze together, sometimes as a ritual, sometimes just bonding while slowly steaming themselves, regrettably. And of course, the sauna doubled as a delivery room, a clinic, and a field hospital if something needed fixing, heating, or cleaning. The Viking answer was almost always cook it first, then freeze it to be sure. These traditions worked so well they stuck around. In fact, modern Nordic countries still keep the sauna culture alive, though nowadays they tend to leave the goats out of it. Surviving the cold was one thing. Surviving boredom, now that was a real war, with long, dark nights, frozen ground, and months without raiding, rowing, or farming. Vikings had to get creative to kill time indoors without losing their minds or murdering their relatives. First up, repairs and prep work. Winter was prime time for sharpening weapons, fixing tools, tightening bows, and patching clothes. If your coat got a hole in October, trust it was stitched up by candlelight come December, unless you fancied frostbite in new and inventive places. Then there was spinning and weaving, women, kids, and anyone with decent hands put in hours turning wool into yarn and yarn into clothes. Not glamorous work, but hey, your cloak didn't sew itself. Every stitch was a tiny barrier between you and death by cold wind. Crafts were a big deal too. Wood carving, bone tools, deer antler combs. Winter turned practicality into art. The longhouse might look gloomy from outside, but inside it was a buzzing hive of productivity, with the occasional curse when someone dropped a needle. Storytelling was huge. Vikings had no Netflix, but they had epic oral tales about gods, heroes, monsters, and family members who made spectacularly bad life choices. These stories were told by firelight, exaggerated with each retelling for maximum drama. Thor didn't just kill the giant, he probably punched the moon afterward. Games also played a part. Vikings loved board games like Hnefatafl, a strategy game that makes chess look like kids' checkers, and dice games mixing luck, cheating, and probably a bit of gambling. Some families even played riddles or staged fake jewelry heists when things got really dull. And of course, mead greased the wheels of all this. Mead made stories funnier, crafting sloppier, and family arguments just a little more entertaining for anyone watching. Vikings didn't just battle the cold with cloaks, campfires, and questionable livestock relationships. They fought it with their minds, not with inspirational posters, but with a deep, grim refusal to be impressed by nature trying to kill them. For the average Norseman, winter wasn't some tragic surprise. It was just part of the schedule, like planting season or planning another raid on France. They didn't fear winter. They prepared for it, expected it, and greeted it with a shrug that said, "Is that all you got?" This wasn't an accident. It was Viking culture. It trained people from birth to see hardship not as a problem, but as a challenge. Cold, pain, hunger. There were oral stories, epic oral tales about gods, heroes, monsters, and other family members who made some seriously bad life choices. These stories were told by the firelight. Each retelling got a little more exaggerated for dramatic effect. Thor didn't just kill a giant. He probably punched the moon afterward. Games also played a part. Vikings played board games like Hnefatafl, a strategy game that makes chess look like a kid's game, plus dice games mixing luck, cheating, and probably a bit of gambling. Some families even did puzzles or staged fake jewelry shows when things got really dull. Of course, mead helped lubricate all this. Mead made storytelling funnier, crafting sloppier, and family arguments a bit more entertaining for outsiders. Vikings didn't just fight the cold with cloaks, campfires, and sketchy livestock relationships. They fought it with their mindset, not some inspirational poster kind, but a deep, brutal refusal to be impressed by nature trying to kill them. For the average Norseman, winter wasn't a surprise or a tragedy. It was just part of the schedule, like planting season or the time to raid France again. They didn't fear winter. They prepared for it, expected it, and greeted it with a resigned shrug. It wasn't an accident. It was Viking culture. They trained people from birth to see hardship not as a problem, but as a challenge. Cold, pain, hunger were not failures. They were character building. No whining allowed. You endured, ideally with a stoic grimace and maybe a sarcastic comment that at least this beats dealing with taxes. This mindset wasn't just cultural, it was spiritual. Norse mythology is packed with frost giants, endless winters, and gods who handled suffering like it was just another Tuesday. When your belief system includes an actual apocalypse called the Cold Winter, an endless, bone-chilling freeze before the world ends, you don't flinch at a little snow. This mental toughness is baked right into society. Weakness isn't mocked. Nope, it's just ignored. Nobody wants to be the guy who can't face the dark, so folks keep going. They stay busy. They joke about the cold, laugh in despair's face, pour me another beer, and keep stitching their 43rd glove. Even kids are taught grit early on. If your fingers freeze, use your elbows. If your toes go numb, walk faster. If you fall on ice and survive, congrats. Now you're cool enough to tell stories about it. Is it healthy? Probably not. Effective? Absolutely. Modern survival guides rave about mindset. Vikings had that down. They didn't see winter as an enemy to beat. They saw it as a test, one they'd passed hundreds of times before. That's how they survived the coldest nights with fire, fur, and a middle finger raised at the wind. If there's one thing Vikings understood better than most, it's this: no one survives winter alone. You could have the warmest cloak, the fattest goat, and the sturdiest longhouse, but without community, you're just a cold guy with fancy accessories. Viking society was built on mutual dependence. Families didn't live isolated. They gathered in farms, villages, or settlements, usually with distant kin and close allies. When winter hit, this network literally became your lifeline. Food got shared, firewood got hauled. If your roof caved in, someone helped fix it. If your kid got sick, someone brought herbs, prayers, or at least a sympathetic grumble. This wasn't generosity for generosity's sake. It was survival math. The more people who made it through winter, the more folks you had come spring to farm, rowboats, fight, or just keep the cows from wandering off during haying season. This season, helping others was helping yourself, even if it meant sharing your last smoked fish with that cousin you barely like. During midwinter parties, like Ule, these bonds were sealed with food, storytelling, and drunken philosophy. These weren't just parties. They were social glue, morale boosters, and reminders that nobody faced the dark alone. Even stockpiling resources reflected this mindset. Grain stores, community butchers, and smokehouses weren't rare. If one family ran out, others pitched in, not out of politeness, but because winter's long, and a weak link could drag the whole group down. Justice and leadership played a role too. Local chieftains, gaudy priests, and legal heads were responsible for keeping order, but also making sure no one froze in a ditch. Their reputation hinged on managing both law and logistics. A respected leader was the one who could settle disputes and organize firewood runs. Of course, there was also peer pressure. If you tried hoarding food or skipping chores, your neighbors noticed. And in Viking society, being judged by the whole village was just a notch worse than death, in the end. Snow fell, darkness loomed, livestock snored in bed. But one thing remained true. Vikings didn't just survive winter, they turned it into a testing ground. Every layer of wool, every wisp of smoke, every grim joke by the fire was part of a cultural blueprint designed for one purpose, only endurance. Winter wasn't a hurdle, it was an opponent. And Vikings trained year-round for the fight. They constantly adapted. If the longhouse was too drafty, they patched it with moss. If the stew was watery, they thickened it with turnips. If the nights dragged on for weeks, they filled them with stories, games, rituals, and the occasional impromptu wrestling match. Between cousins, no central heating, fine by them. They made fire pits. Waterproof gear was just a dream. They had to invent it from stubborn sheep and sheer grit. No antidepressants, just fairy tales, me, and a dark humor so sharp seasonal depression didn't dare show up. And while other civilizations slowed down in winter, Vikings used it as a power-up. Weapons got fixed, kids got trained, new ideas sparked by the firelight. When the ice melted, these folks weren't stumbling into sunlight. Nope, they were ready to farm, build ships, forge alliances, or sail oceans to warmer, richer, or just more loot-worthy places. Winter didn't make them weak. It sharpened them leaner, meaner, and way more creative. Their success wasn't magic or divine isolation. It came from relentless hustle, often clouded in smoke, surviving by any means necessary, whether that meant sleeping under a goat, saunaing in a hut, or eating yogurt that doubled as industrial glue. They did it, and they did it together. Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12th, 1809, in a one-room log cabin on the edge of Kentucky wilderness, a place where survival wasn't guaranteed and schooling was, well, optional. His dad, Thomas Lincoln, was a hard-working farmer and carpenter, but barely educated. His mom, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was quiet, gentle, and literate, a rare gem on the frontier. They lived nearly in poverty, scraping by on thin soil and dense forests. The cabin had no windows, no floors, and definitely no bookshelves. Most of young Abraham's world was candlelight, silence, and hard labor. He grew up chopping wood, hauling water, and wearing patched clothes that were more rags than fabric. He didn't get formal schooling. Actually, Lincoln later estimated he had less than a year of real education in his whole life. But he had something stronger, a restless soul, and a burning thirst to learn. When Nancy Hanks died in 1818, possibly from milk sickness, Abe was just 9 years old. Her death left a hole in his life that never really closed. She was his emotional anchor, the one who saw something different in him. After burying her by hand in the woods behind their farm, young Abe carved a wooden board himself. It was rough, crude, soaked with tears, but it said it all. He missed her. A few months later, Thomas remarried a widow named Sarah Bush Johnston. Unlike the evil stepmom stereotype, Sarah brought warmth, books, and rules. She spotted Lincoln's smarts and sparked his curiosity. Between chores, he devoured anything he could get his hands on: Aesop's fables, Robinson Crusoe, the Bible. If no books were around, he'd write his thoughts in charcoal on scraps of wood. This barefoot, skinny kid with a face way too serious for his age was starting to build something inside. The world gave him no money, no connections, no comfort, but he had a fire that wouldn't quit. And in that tiny log cabin in Kentucky's woods, Abraham Lincoln began a long, unbelievable journey toward greatness. As Lincoln hit his teens, life on the frontier didn't get any easier. If anything, it got tougher. The family moved again, this time to the thick forests and swamps of Indiana. Every day was a battle against nature, chopping trees, plowing heavy clay soil, and surviving brutal winters with little more than a fire and hope. But while his body toughened under axe and earth, his mind was somewhere else entirely. Neighbors knew him, not for brute strength, though he was strong, but for his towering height and weird reading habits whenever free. He carried books on walks, memorized Shakespeare while fixing fences, and sat under trees, jotting thoughts on any scrap of paper he could find. Age had started to form something inside him. The world gave him little, no money, no connections, no comforts. But he had a fire inside that couldn't be put out, and in that tiny wooden cabin in the Kentucky woods, Abraham's, Lincoln began his long, unbelievable journey toward greatness. As Lincoln hit his teens, life on the frontier didn't get any easier. If anything, it got tougher. His family moved again, this time to the thick forests and swamps of Indiana. Every day was a battle against nature, chopping trees, tilling heavy clay soil, and surviving brutal winters with just a little fire and a lot of hope. But while his body was forged by axe and land, his mind was somewhere else entirely. Neighbors knew him not for strength, though he was strong, but for his towering height and odd reading habits whenever he had free time. Of leisure, he carried books on walks, recited Shakespeare while fixing fences, and sat under trees, jotting down thoughts in the margins of any scrap paper he could find. His humor started to bloom, dry, observant, sometimes self-deprecating. He was a weirdo, a skinny teen who often quoting Thomas Jefferson while others spun hunting tales. Lincoln. He had this awkward social vibe, shy, yet talkative, weird but oddly charming. When he spoke, folks actually listened. They just couldn't help themselves. His words were clear, strong, sometimes funny, but always hitting something real. His moral compass, even then, was dead set on. He hated cruelty, he hated slavery, and he hated how people used ignorance to justify both. Even though he wasn't formally trained, Lincoln started developing a passion for law, the idea that words, not fists, could win battles that tickled him. He taught himself to write clearly and argue logically. He read every law book he could get his hands on at night, while others were out drinking or gambling. Lincoln was holed up in a dark room reading Blackstone's commentaries by candlelight. By his early 20s, he left home for good. He worked as a flatboat pilot on the Mississippi River and witnessed firsthand the horrors of the slave trade in New Orleans. Those images stuck with him, etched deep into his conscience. When he came back, he moved to New Salem, Illinois, and began reinventing himself. He taught himself grammar, joined the local debate club, and with sheer willpower, he started a long journey to become a lawyer. No degree, no credentials, no fancy pedigree, just a belief that knowledge is power and can be earned, like everything else in life, through effort, vision, and a little pain. When Abraham Lincoln became a lawyer, he turned into a legend in central Illinois, not because of fame, but because of presence. He wasn't the kind of guy who burst into a room demanding attention with flashy clothes or slick charm. He usually wore wrinkled clothes, pants too short, and a jacket that didn't quite fit. But when he stood up to speak, everyone leaned in. He had something worth more than fashion clarity, honesty, and empathy. Lincoln's law career didn't follow the usual script. No law school for him. He borrowed law books from generous lawyers and passed the bar by teaching himself. Once admitted, he hit the 8th Judicial Circuit, a sprawling network of rural courts. He traveled by horseback, sometimes for weeks, muddy in spring, dusty in summer, and freezing in winter. He slept in taverns, cabins, and under the stars, but he loved it. What set Lincoln apart in court wasn't just his logic, it was his empathy. He connected with juries in ways polished lawyers never could. He spoke plainly, told vivid stories, and treated even the smallest farmer or poorest widow with respect. One farmer said, "He makes you feel like he's one of us, not above us." And that's the truth. Lincoln never forgot where he came from and never pretended to be something he wasn't. But don't confuse that with weakness. In court, when a case mattered, when he believed in it, he was relentless. His speeches could be slow, even awkward, but they were powerful. He laid out facts like bricks, one by one, until the opposition crumbled under their own contradictions. His questioning was like gentle traps. He'd soothe witnesses into comfort, then drop a question that shattered their testimony. Over time, Lincoln became known as Honest Abe, not just a campaign slogan. He earned it. He'd refund fees if he thought a case was unjust. He refused to represent lying clients, and when other lawyers cut corners, he simply walked away. His reputation grew as a lawyer who understood the law and the country, but behind the scenes, a different fire was quietly burning. Politics. Law taught him how people operate. Now, he wanted to help change the system they lived in. And as slavery became a hot national topic, Lincoln's clear conscience was about to scream. Lincoln's real political breakthrough wasn't exactly instant. In 1832, at just 23, he ran for politics. Law taught him how people work. Now, he wanted to change the system they lived in. And as slavery became the hot topic nationwide, Lincoln's clear conscience was about to scream. Lincoln's first real political breakthrough wasn't exactly overnight. In 1832, at just 23, he ran for the Illinois state legislature and lost. But losing didn't crush him. If anything, it just made clear what he needed to do next. Listen more, learn more, and meet people where they lived. 2 years later, he tried again and won in Springfield, the brand new capital. Lincoln quickly got famous for deep speeches, sharp wit, and moral conviction. He didn't shout. No sneaky schemes either. But when he stood up in the Capitol, everyone remembered him. He didn't care about cheap victories or flashy slogans. His goal was deeper to understand how law, society, and justice really worked. Lincoln teamed up with the Whig Party, a group that believed in modernization, infrastructure, and limiting executive power. But even with the Whig, he stayed cautious about ambition. He often joked that he was too ugly for politics. He read tons, debated fiercely, but never seemed hungry for power like the other guys. Maybe politics was more a burden he accepted than a dream he chased. Over 4 terms in the Illinois legislature, Lincoln built alliances with farmers, merchants, and fellow lawyers. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but usually the most reliable. He was famous for sticking to his principles, especially on slavery. Though he hadn't called for abolition yet, he was firmly against expanding slavery into new territories. He called it injustice, immoral, the country's own hypocrisy. In 1846, Lincoln stepped onto the national stage, winning a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. There, he took a bold and unpopular stand opposing the Mexican-American War, calling it unconstitutional and unnecessary. Not exactly a winning political move. His district didn't like it. He served just one term and didn't run again. Back in Springfield, he went back to law, married Mary Todd, an educated woman from a wealthy Kentucky family, and tried for a quieter life. But the country was changing fast. The Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and slavery's expansion tore the nation apart. Lincoln might have left politics, but politics hadn't left him. The debates got bigger and bloodier. The Union started to crack, and the man once known for caution was about to rise not as a candidate, but as a conscience. By the 1850s, slavery wasn't just a concern anymore. It was boiling over. The 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act, letting new territories decide if they wanted slavery, sparked violent chaos and deeper division. Bloody Kansas became the national symbol of the mess for Abraham Lincoln. This was a turning point. He couldn't stay silent any longer. He returned to politics, not with fanfare, but with moral urgency. He joined the newly formed Republican Party, a mix of former Whigs, liberals, and abolitionists, all united against slavery's expansion. Lincoln wasn't a radical abolitionist. He hadn't called for immediate emancipation, but he deeply believed slavery was wrong, and letting it spread into new states was both dangerous and unjust. In 1858, he became a national figure during his Senate race against Stephen A. Douglas, one of America's most famous politicians. The two agreed to a series of debates across Illinois, which turned into one of the most famous political showdowns in U.S. history, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Douglas defended popular sovereignty, the idea that each state should decide on slavery. Lincoln pushed back hard. He said a house divided can't stand. If slavery kept spreading, it would tear the Union apart. He argued the country couldn't keep living half slave, half free forever. He lost the Senate race but won something bigger, national attention. Newspapers ran his words coast to coast. People who'd never heard of Lincoln before were now whispering about the tall, deep-eyed lawyer from Illinois with even deeper convictions. Though he lost, he proved his mettle. He stood toe-to-toe with one of the era's greatest orators and never backed down. He challenged the country's comfort not for personal gain, but because his conscience demanded it. Lincoln himself struggled with the seriousness of this problem. He once wrote that if slavery wasn't wrong, then nothing was wrong at all. But he also knew that moving too fast could shatter this fragile balance. Still, the die was cast. The whole country's mood was shifting, and Lincoln was rising with it. not as some politician with easy answers, but as the voice of moral clarity in a morally murky time. By 1860, America was teetering on the edge of a cliff. Tensions between the parts had hit the breaking point. Slavery was no longer just a moral debate. It was a political storm. Southern states were threatening to secede, and the Republicans were scrambling to find a leader who could unite the North without kicking off a war right away. The unexpected hero, Abraham Lincoln, at the Republican National Conventions in Chicago, he wasn't the front-runner. Honestly, most expected the nomination to go to Senator William Seward from New York, a seasoned politician with decades of experience. But Lincoln had something the others didn't: a clean reputation, a moderate tone, and serious momentum from debates with Douglas. His crew worked hard behind the scenes, hyping up his frontier roots and personal honesty. Lincoln was portrayed as a self-made man, a rail splitter who rose from nothing. His humble start wasn't a liability. It was the symbol of America's potential. By the third ballot, he snagged the nomination, stunning the political elite. The general election was brutal and divided. The Democrats split into northern and southern factions, backing different candidates. Lincoln's name didn't even show up on most southern ballots, but in the North and West, he had massive support. On November 6, 1860, he was elected as the 16th President of the United States with just 40% of the popular vote, but a majority of the electoral votes. He didn't celebrate, actually. The mood was pretty grim. Within weeks, South Carolina voted to secede. 6 more southern states followed before he even took office. The country was unraveling faster than anyone expected as he prepared to travel from Springfield to Washington, for his inauguration. Lincoln kept getting death threats. Some warned he wouldn't make the trip alive. Security was so tight he had to sneak into the Capitol by train at night, in disguise, and totally unannounced. This was no triumphant entrance for a winner. It was the reluctant arrival of a president-elect who'd already cracked the Union. On March 4th, 1861, when Lincoln officially took the oath, he faced a divided, angry, and heavily armed nation. But in his speech, he aimed for peace, not revenge. He said, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies." Still, the winds of war were howling at the door. Less than a month after Abraham Lincoln's inauguration, the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. What followed was the bloodiest conflict in U.S. history, a brutal test not just of military might, but also of Lincoln's character, leadership, and resolve. Lincoln had no military experience. He'd briefly served as a captain in the Black Hawk War, but never saw combat. Now he was commander-in-chief of a nation fighting itself. He spent countless late nights in the War Department, reading telegrams, studying maps, and quickly learning strategy. He devoured books on war, grilled his generals, and obsessed over troop movements. Not a born warrior, but one shaped by necessity. His first presidential term was marked by frustration. One general after another let him down, especially George McClellan, who had the Army's loyalty, but the cautiousness of a guy scared of a fight. Lincoln, fed up with delays and excuses, once asked, "If General McClellan won't use the Army, I'd like to borrow it for a while." But Lincoln's real genius wasn't just in military strategy, battlefield decisions. It's right there in plain sight. He knew this war wasn't just about states' rights or secession. It was about the very soul of the nation. Can a country built on freedom survive if half its people are enslaved? At first, Lincoln played it safe on slavery, worried that a hardcore abolition might push the border states into the Southern Confederacy. But as the war dragged on and casualties piled up, his mind changed. Morality and military strategy became inseparable. He realized slavery was the engine powering the Southern economy and spirit. Unless it was crushed, the rebellion would never die. So, on January 1st, 1863, he dropped the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring all slaves in Confederate-held territories free. It didn't magically free everyone overnight, but it flipped the script. The war was no longer just about saving the Union. It was a fight for human freedom internationally. It shut down British and French support for the Confederacy. At home, it gave black men a moral and legal reason to join. The Union Army and thousands did, fighting for a country that had long denied them citizenship. Lincoln transformed from a log cabin lawyer into a wartime president, wielding not just power but moral authority. By the fourth year of war, he bore the burden alone at the top, thinner, grayer, and looking worn out. Every day, another casualty list. Towns turned into graveyards. He got letters from grieving mothers and wives, all demanding to know why their sons and husbands had died. Though he never fought on the battlefield, Lincoln carried the war in his eyes and on his shoulders. His cabinet was a motley crew of political rivals, men who had run against him and didn't always respect him. But Lincoln managed them like a maestro, balancing ambition and purpose. He didn't rule with fear or force. He ruled with patience, stories, and clarity. Even his critics began to admit this guy had iron beneath that smile. Then came Gettysburg. The July 1863 battle was a turning point. Over 50,000 dead, wounded, or missing in 3 brutal days. Months later, Lincoln showed up in Pennsylvania for a short speech at the new cemetery, not trying to steal the spotlight, just a few words to ponder. But with only 272 words, he rewrote the purpose of the war, that this nation, under God's rule, would have a rebirth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people would not perish from the earth. The Gettysburg Address was anything but flashy. It was restrained, reverent, and timeless, proving this war was more than just unity. It was redemption, rebuilding the country as it always claimed to be. As the 1864 presidential election approached, Lincoln faced fierce opposition. The war was dragging on, and his support was slipping, even within his own party. Calls to replace him on the ticket surfaced. Many thought he'd lose to Democrat George McClellan, the general he had fired, but as the Union scored victories late that year, especially when General Sherman took Atlanta, Momentum swung back to Lincoln's favor. He was re-elected in a landslide. Still, Lincoln wasn't smug. "Winning isn't in my nature," he said. The war was nearly won. But Lincoln knew peace would be harder. The Union could be rebuilt with muskets, but the soul of the nation needed something way deeper: mercy, vision, and healing. By early 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. Cities fell one by one. Richmond, the Confederate capital, was burning. General Robert E. Lee's army was running low on supplies. Richmond, the Confederate capital, was burning down. General Robert E. Lee's army was running low on supplies, troops, and time. Yet Lincoln wasn't celebrating. Victory to him was never about punishment. It was about restoration. In his second inaugural address on March 4th, 1865, Lincoln spoke not like a conqueror, but like a moral philosopher. He said no ill will toward anyone, charity for all, and steadfastness in righteousness. As God gave us the eye to see what's right, let's try to finish the job we started. Not the words of a politician looking to crush his enemies, but a dad trying to save his broken family. On April 9th, Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Court. The war was over. The Union was preserved. Slavery was abolished with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. For the first time in centuries, the country took a shaky step toward the ideals it claimed back in 1776. But just as everyone sighed in relief, tragedy struck. Only 5 days after the surrender, Abraham Lincoln went to see a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. Mid-show, Southern sympathizer and actor John Wilkes Booth snuck into the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. He died the next morning, April 15th, 1865. The whole country was more heartbroken than ever. Newly freed Black Americans wept in the streets. Old enemies, even in the South, acknowledged this huge loss. He was their best shot at reconciliation. A man who never saw politics as war and never let hatred take root in his heart. Lincoln didn't live to see Reconstruction or heal the wounds his presidency laid bare, but his death turned him from a leader into a symbol of freedom, unity, and the painful cost of moral progress. From the dirt floor of a Kentucky cabin to the highest office in the land, Abraham Lincoln rose without money, without privilege, and without cruelty. He led a nation through its darkest moment, not with flash, but with steady, persistent light, and that light, though dimmed by an assassin's bullet, keeps burning in America's story. When we imagine the ancient world, we usually picture mighty empires, shiny temples, and epic battles. What we rarely think about is how those folks took care of their business, literally, but hygiene, or the lack thereof, shaped daily life just as much as any king or war. Behind every marble palace or mud brick house, there was someone dealing with the mess in a time before flush buttons or fancy sprays. Going to the bathroom was a public event and way more attention-grabbing than we like to admit. Ancient toilets weren't just about comfort. They were crucial for survival. Human waste carries germs, and when poorly managed, as usual, entire communities pay the price. Disagreement, cholera, and parasites were the invisible serial killers. In cities without sewage systems, waste piled up on streets, seeped into wells, and stuck to sandals, but where hygiene mattered. Something remarkable happened. Lifespans increased, plagues lessened, and cities thrived, surprisingly. Some of the world's oldest civilizations developed systems that don't seem totally out of place today. Cities in the Indus Valley had street-wide drainage and brick toilets. The Minoans built ceramic pipes and flushing mechanisms. The Romans practically turned waste management into an art form. While other societies like the Vikings or early Chinese dynasties handled things more crudely, they still reflected cultural ideas about health, humility, and nature. But to be clear, ancient toilets weren't always private, weren't always clean, and definitely weren't dignified. Public latrines were common, especially in military camps or urban centers. Picture 20 stone seats lined up with no dividers, everyone sitting shoulder to shoulder. The Romans basically turned waste management into an art form. While other societies like the Vikings or early Chinese dynasties handled things way more crudely, they still had methods reflecting cultural ideas about health, humility, and nature. But let's be clear, old-time toilets weren't always private, weren't always clean, and definitely weren't fancy. Public toilets were the usual deal, especially in army camps or city centers. Picture 20 stone holes lined up with no dividers. People sitting shoulder to shoulder, chatting, arguing, all while doing their business. Shared sponges on sticks passed around. Water used to clean up, not always to flush. And right below all that, literally, were drains, cesspools, and sometimes just the earliest open sewers. Hygiene is a mirror of society's values. Where it's ignored, chaos reigns. Where it's organized, civilization thrives. And if you dare to look past the filth, you'll uncover a hidden history. Pipes, pits, and poop tell us way more about ancient life than fancy ruins ever could. Long before the Romans built aqueducts or the Greeks dreamed of public baths, the folks in the Indus Valley had tackled one of civilization's nastiest problems: sanitation. Dating back to around 2600 BC, the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, now in modern Pakistan, showed surprisingly advanced urban planning, especially when it came to dealing with human waste. At first glance, these ancient city ruins look like dusty old piles of rubble, but look closer and you'll see a tightly organized grid of brick-paved streets with standardized measurements and covered drainage systems running alongside them. Yep, while most of the world was still digging holes in the ground, the Indus people figured out how to keep their cities airy and their homes clean. Every house, even the modest ones, had a small room dedicated to washing, usually with a squat toilet or bathing area connected to a vertical chute. This chute dumped waste into covered brick drains outside, which then fed into a larger public sewer system. These were no crude ditches. They had inspection holes, slopes, and even brick baffles to catch solids. Some scholars think waste from wealthier homes flushed via water tanks. while gravity did the rest. And this brilliance didn't stop at toilets. The Indus system also separated rainwater from sewage. Public wells dotted the streets. While we can't be sure how they kept water safe, the very presence of sanitation infrastructure shows they cared about public health, a rare thing back then. But maybe the most shocking thing was the total lack of palaces or temples in these cities. The Indus folks seemed way more interested in equality and practical city function than in sacred monuments. And their toilets reflected that: practical, common, and surprisingly democratic. Sadly, much about the Indus civilization remains a mystery. Their writing system still hasn't been cracked, and we have no clue why their cities eventually declined. But their toilets, the silent brick pipes buried beneath their feet, still tell a lot. In an era when many empires ruled with flashy displays, the Indus people went with something quieter, cleaner, and arguably more civilized, while the Indus Valley built underground sewers. Ancient Egyptians took a different approach to sanitation, a people steeped in ritual and a deep belief in physical and spiritual purity. For them, cleanliness wasn't just about dodging disease, it was worship. In ancient Nile civilization, bathing was an essential daily habit, especially for the rich. Elite homes often had small limestone water basins or bathing rooms where servants poured water for washing. Oils, natron, natural salts, and fragrant ointments were common, and hair removal was routine. But when it came to toilets, things got a bit more down to earth. Ancient Egyptian toilets ranged from simple sand-lined pits to fancier limestone seats or wooden chairs perched on ceramic jars. These jars were emptied by servants or slaves and tossed far from the house, ideally into the desert, in wealthier homes. These seats might be stored in private rooms, hinting at a growing link between sanitation and status. However, public sanitation was almost non-existent. Streets in cities like Thebes or Memphis were often filthy, and though waste was sometimes used as fertilizer in rural areas, it wasn't always managed responsibly in urban centers. Instead, the focus remained on personal hygiene. For example, priests talking toilets. Things get a bit more real. Ancient Egyptian toilets came in all shapes, from simple sand-lined pits to fancier limestone seats or wooden chairs over clay pots. These pots were carried off and dumped by servants or slaves far from home, ideally in the desert, in richer homes. These seats might be stored in private rooms, hinting at a growing link between hygiene and status. But public toilets were basically non-existent. Streets in cities like Thebes or Memphis were often filthy, and while waste was sometimes used as fertilizer in the countryside, it wasn't always managed responsibly in urban centers. Instead, the focus was on personal hygiene. For example, priests bathed multiple times a day, shaved body hair, and avoided impurities. They couldn't enter temples unless they performed cleansing rituals, sometimes including enemas not for health, but spiritual prep. Interestingly, tombs of pharaohs and nobles sometimes included toilet seats among their burial goods. Seems the Ancient Egyptians figured even in the afterlife, you still gotta do your business and do it properly. They were also early pest control enthusiasts, using amulets, spells, and ointments to shoo away flies and other disease carriers. So cleanliness back then was both a physical and mystical thing, basically. Egypt didn't have fancy sewer systems, but they were pioneers in culturally embracing hygiene. Their obsession with purity shaped medicine, religion, and everyday life. Sure, their toilets might have been simple, but their idea of cleanliness, that was anything but basic. While most Bronze Age Europeans were still digging holes in the ground, the Minoans on Crete were flushing. Yes, flushing. Over 3,500 years ago, the Minoan civilization, booming from around 2000 to 1400 BC, developed one of the most sophisticated plumbing systems of the ancient world. Their capital, Knossos, wasn't just the setting for labyrinth legends and fancy frescoes. It had multi-story buildings with running water and working toilets. The Minoans nailed something most other civilizations only figured out centuries later: gravity and water pressure. Their palace had clay pipes under floors and walls, channeling rain and spring water to fountains, baths, and most impressively, toilets. At Knossos' Queen's Megaron, archaeologists found what might be the oldest flushing toilet ever: a wooden seat perched over a stone basin connected to a vertical pipe you could flush manually with a jug. Baths were a big deal too. The Minoans built large ceramic tubs that aren't too different from what you'd see in modern homes. Water came from rooftop cisterns or aqueducts and drained out through underground channels. They might have even used U-shaped traps to block sewer smells, the great-great-grandparent of today's plumbing traps, though that's still up for debate. What really stands out is how these systems were built into fancy houses, showing that comfort and cleanliness were status symbols. Unlike later Roman public latrines, Minoan toilets were private affairs, right inside your house, luxury that even many 19th century Europeans lacked. The Minoans weren't just practical, they were stylish. Their bathrooms were decorated with colorful frescoes and elegant plasterwork. Hygiene was both functional and fashionable. Sadly, the Minoan civilization collapsed around 1450 BC, maybe thanks to a volcano, tsunami, or invasion taking these innovations down with it. It took over 1,000 years for similar toilet tech to pop up again elsewhere in the Mediterranean. Still, the ruins of Knossos whisper a simple truth: wanting to be clean, flush your waste, and bathe in private isn't some modern obsession. It's ancient, deeply human, and in the Minoans' case, way ahead of its time. When it comes to ancient hygiene, no civilization made bolder claims than the Romans. At their empire's peak, Romans mastered building infrastructure, aqueducts, roads, and yes, toilets. For them, hygiene wasn't just about cleanliness, it was civilization itself. That meant public toilets efficient, social, and surprisingly civilized. Step into any major Roman city from Pompeii to Londinium, and you'd find open rooms with rows of stone seats, each carved with evenly spaced holes. No stalls, no privacy, just seats side by side. Underneath flowed a constant stream of water washing away waste, plus a side channel holding sponge sticks. Yes, Romans used sponges on sticks instead of toilet paper. Surprisingly social. Walk into any big Roman city from Pompeii to Londinium, and you'd probably find public toilets, big open rooms with long stone benches, each with evenly spaced holes. No stalls, no dividers, just seats squeezed together. Underneath those benches, a stream of water flowed non-stop to flush away the mess, plus a side channel holding sponge sticks. Tessa Aurea, the Romans' answer to toilet paper. These sponges got rinsed with water and vinegar, then reused. Hygiene. Not really. Functional? Oh yeah, for Romans. Using the loo wasn't a private thing. It was a social event. People chatted, gossiped, did business deals. All while taking care of nature's call. Toilets were often decorated with mosaics or inscriptions. Some funny, some downright rude. The bathroom graffiti in Pompeii included complaints about the stench, lousy plumbing, and even rude users. But Roman sanitation was way bigger than just toilets. Their cities were crawling with cloaca, those giant sewer systems. The most famous being Rome's Cloaca Maxima, originally built to drain marshes. It became the backbone of Rome's waste management. Rainwater, pee, and poop all flowed through it, fed by aqueducts bringing fresh water from miles away. In private homes, rich Romans had toilets draining into cesspools or directly into the sewers. The poor had to use chamber pots, sometimes tossed out windows onto the streets illegal. But who cared, those living in apartment buildings, especially multi-story ones, got the worst deal. Many buildings had no plumbing at all, and lower floors often flooded with sewage. Fun fact, Romans taxed. Urine. Emperor Vespasian even slapped a tax on public urinals, a move so infamous his name still sticks to urinals in France and Italy today. In short, Roman toilets weren't just advanced, they were noisy, crowded, political, and oddly progressive. Maybe the first big attempt at public hygiene. While Romans treated public pooping like a community picnic, the ancient Greeks took a more modest approach. To them, bodily functions were private business, best handled quietly, discreetly, and solo. Still, they made significant contributions to hygiene and cleanliness, just with a very different vibe. Most Greek homes had simple toilets, a clay pot or stone seat over a hole, no flushing systems, no sewage drains in usual residences. Waste was usually collected and dumped manually, often by slaves, into pits or far-off places. City streets sometimes had open drains, but as cities grew, so did the stink. Hygiene was an issue, but not always top priority. However, Greeks were obsessed with bathing. The gym, where men exercised naked, was nearly always linked to large public baths, not just for wiping sweat. They were social hubs, spots to mingle, debate philosophy, and prep for citizen life. Unlike the lavish, marble-filled Roman baths, Greek baths were simpler round tubs, cold water basins, or shallow pools. Water management played a key role in this bathing culture. Greeks built aqueducts, channels, and clay pipe systems to bring fresh water to cities like Athens. In fact, the Athenian agora had one of the earliest public toilets, complete with stone seats and drainage, but these were still rare. Public toilets never really became a norm in Greek society like they did in Rome. What Greeks lacked in plumbing, they made up for in theory. Hippocrates, dubbed the father of medicine, was one of the first to link hygiene to health. He believed dirty water and waste spread disease, a radical idea back then. His advice about clean air, fresh water, and dry homes later influenced Roman city planning. The irony is crystal clear. The civilization that gave us democracy and drama still liked to handle their grossest problems privately. For the Greeks, hygiene wasn't just about infrastructure, it was personal discipline and philosophical cleanliness. Clean body, clean mind. Though their toilets were basic, their obsession with purity, both physical and moral, helped lay the groundwork for modern public health thinking. In ancient China, cleanliness was both a personal duty and a reflection of the universe's balance. Personal duty and cosmic harmony. Hygiene, though lacking the heavy infrastructure of Rome or the Indus Valley, was deeply embedded in daily life through customs, philosophy, and a surprising variety of hygiene tools. Most ancient Chinese homes didn't have toilets like we know them today. Instead, chamber pots were the go-to. These portable ceramic or bronze containers came in all shapes and sizes, from basic to fancy, depending on your social status. After use, servants or family members would dump them into bigger pits inside the house or haul them outside the city walls. Some rural families used human waste, called black earth, as fertilizer, a tradition that lasted centuries. Public toilets existed too, especially in big cities like Chang'an or Luoyang. These public conveniences were usually just pits or troughs with wooden floors to sit or squat on. Fun fact, some even had privacy partitions, a courtesy rare in ancient Rome. Waste from these places was often collected and reused in farming, which worked, but obviously risked pollution and disease. Toilet paper, or something like it, might have been scraps of discarded writing paper for cleaning up. By the 6th century AD, scholars noted the special use of paper for wiping after bathroom visits. The upper class preferred scraps of silk or bamboo spoons washed after each use. Yep, you heard right. Bamboo sticks polished clean were among the earliest reusable wiping tools. Hygiene wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, influenced by Confucian ideals of order and respect, plus beliefs in harmony and purity. Cleanliness was tied to discipline and balance. Poop, while natural, was seen as pollution, something to get rid of fast and never talk about in polite company. Royal families took this so seriously, they appointed special servants to handle waste completely, in secret, even without sewers. Ancient China kept urban centers pretty clean thanks to meticulous human labor, taboo culture, and well-organized waste collection. Not glamorous, but it worked. Through chamber pots, compost, and paper scraps, the Chinese carved out their own modest, effective, and tradition-steeped hygiene path. When it comes to ancient sanitation, Vikings might not be the first to pop into your head. Famous for raiding, not routine habits, Norse hygiene was actually way more sophisticated and disciplined than you'd guess. Behind the horned helmet myths was a culture that, while rough, cared a lot more about personal cleanliness and waste management than most of medieval Europe. At Viking settlements, especially places like Jorvik, modern-day York, England, and Hedeby in Germany, archaeologists found wooden or stone-lined latrines, basic toilets used by individuals and households alike. These pits were usually dug a short distance from homes and sometimes covered with wooden structures for privacy and protection from harsh northern weather. Waste from these toilets, including human poop, leftover food, and animal remains, tells us more than just what Vikings ate. It shows they had centralized waste disposal methods. Sometimes these pits were regularly cleaned and reused. Other times, they just dug a new one when the old filled up. Some evidence even suggests early composting, since waste naturally decomposed and returned to the soil over time. Indoors, chamber pots and buckets were common, especially during long, cold winters when going outside wasn't ideal. They were often emptied into latrines or manure piles near the settlement edge. Not glamorous, but way more practical and sanitary than just tossing trash in the street, which was common in some medieval towns. But Viking hygiene wasn't just functional, it was cultural. They bathed regularly, usually about once a week, using wooden daggers, centralized waste disposal methods. In some places, these pits were cleaned out regularly and reused. Elsewhere, folks just dug a new hole once the old one filled up. Some evidence even suggests they composted early on because waste breaks down naturally and returns to the earth over time. Inside homes, chamber pots and buckets were popular, especially during those long, freezing winters when going outside wasn't exactly a joy. They were usually dumped into latrine pits or manure heaps near the settlement edges. Not glamorous, but definitely way more practical and hygienic than just tossing trash in the street. Something medieval cities did a lot. But hygiene wasn't just about function, it was cultural too. Vikings bathed regularly, about once a week, using wooden daggers. Laundry day, that's where the English word Saturday comes from. Combs, ear-cleaning tools, and tweezers made from bone or antler were common finds at Nordic archaeological sites. Grooming wasn't just about looking good, it tied into social status and marriage prospects. While Viking sanitation didn't have the tech wizardry of Rome or the ritual purity of Egypt, was all about pragmatism. No fancy sewers or toilet paper inventions, but they managed their waste, stayed clean, and adapted to their harsh, icy environment with some straight-up practical solutions. In a land of ice and steel, even taking care of business was handled roughly, like people who just didn't have time for drama. Across civilizations and centuries, one truth stayed rock solid. No society grows without handling its waste. From the Indus Valley's underground drainage to Roman public toilets and ancient China's chamber pots, humanity's relationship with hygiene has always teetered on the fine line between necessity and neglect. What's fascinating is how different cultures prioritized cleanliness. Some, like the Romans and Minoans, pumped serious resources into infrastructure. They built aqueducts, drainage systems, and sewage networks that sometimes rivaled 19th century cities. Others, like the Greeks and Chinese, saw cleanliness as a personal virtue linked to health, morality, and harmony with nature. Then you had the Vikings with their no-nonsense, rough approach: dig a hole, rinse when you can, and whatever you do, don't let crap get on your food, despite their differences. These societies shared one goal: keep humans separate from their trash. For many reasons: disease prevention, honoring gods, maintaining social order, you name it. And the outcome shaped how cities grew, laws were made, and how people viewed their own bodies. Ironically, much of this ancient wisdom got lost in Europe during the Middle Ages. After Rome fell, modern sanitation systems collapsed, public toilets vanished, sewers clogged, and plagues ran wild. Urban planners had to spend centuries and survive multiple pandemics before dusting off the old ideas that people once nailed. But traces of ancient sanitation still linger today. The word latrine, straight from Latin latrina, modern flushing toilets, thanks to the Minoans' gravity-fed systems. Even our bathroom paper was foreshadowed by the Chinese over 1,000 years ago. What feels modern is often just a rediscovery. Hygiene, usually the wallflower in history stories, is actually civilization's silent backbone. It doesn't inspire poetry or monuments, but without it, cities collapse, populations shrink, and empires might just crumble. So next time you enjoy your private bathroom, running water, and scented soap, remember you're standing on the shoulders of generations who tried, failed, and sometimes succeeded at stopping the stink. And honestly, that might be civilization's most underrated achievement. Before satellites, compasses, or even writing, humans had an instinct for mapping, not just marking locations, but understanding their place in a vast, often terrifying world. Maps aren't just terrain pictures, they're stories, belief systems, survival guides. They tell you where rivers flow, where the sun rises, which spirits rule, and where danger lurks just beyond the known. Early maps weren't drawn on parchment or paper. They were carved in stone, etched on bones, or woven into oral memory. Prehistoric carvings from the Old Stone Age over 14,000 years ago show animals, riverbanks, and hut clusters. Are these modern maps? Not really, but they capture space, movement, and meaning. A basic start. As early societies popped up and trade routes expanded, maps became essential power tools. They guided merchants through mountains and deserts, helped kings draw borders, a belief system, a survival manual. It told people where rivers flowed, where the sun rose, where spirits lived, and where dangers lurked just beyond the known. Some of the earliest maps weren't drawn on parchment or paper. They were carved in stone, etched on bone, or woven into oral memory. Prehistoric carvings from the Old Stone Age, over 14,000 years ago, show animals, riverbanks, and clusters of huts. Are they maps in the modern sense? Not really, but they captured space, connected to movement and meaning. A basic start. When early societies popped up and trade routes expanded, maps became essential power tools. They guided merchants through mountains and deserts. They helped kings mark borders and tax their subjects. They even tried to explain the cosmos by mixing astronomy with theology. Star maps were sacred territory. Mapping a city meant bringing order to chaos. But maps weren't always about accuracy. Ancient maps were often wildly distorted by today's standards. What mattered was meaning, not measurements. The center of the world was always home, whether that was Babylon, Jerusalem, or the island of Dos. Land areas stretched or shrank depending on how important they were. Unknown lands were filled with weird creatures or just labeled dragons live here. Some cultures didn't even use flat maps. For example, Polynesian sailors crafted stick maps to record ocean currents and waves around islands, not to look at with eyes, but to feel with hands and brain. These maps weren't for reading like modern ones, but for sensing and memorizing through ritual practice. Mapping, picturing space, time, and place is a deep human instinct. Whether carved in clay, painted on walls, or sung spontaneously, maps helped ancient folks connect with their environment, gods, and each other. And while their methods varied wildly, their goal was always the same: to figure out where they stood in a mysterious, ever-changing world, in the cradle of civilization, between temples and pyramids of ancient Mesopotamia. The Babylonians started carving the earliest known maps onto clay. These weren't just practical tools for land ownership or city planning. They were cosmic documents, efforts to impose order on a chaotic world by recording it in lines and cuneiform symbols. One famous example is the Imago Mundi, a clay tablet from the 6th century BCE, now chilling at the British Museum. It's often called the oldest known world map, at just 6 inches across. It's a tiny window into the Babylonian universe. At the center sits Babylon, drawn as a rectangle surrounded by a circular landmass representing the known world. The Euphrates River cuts through the middle, with cities, mountains, and various regions marked consistently. On the other side of the world is a bitter river, probably the ocean, and beyond that, mysterious triangular islands, each with mythic descriptions. These weren't real places. They were symbols of chaos and danger, the outer edge of what was knowable to the Babylonians. Mapping wasn't just geography, it was spiritual. The sky was mapped just as carefully as the earth. Babylonian astronomers tracked planet movements, moon cycles, and eclipses with shocking precision. All of this was etched on clay tablets with reed pens. These sky records weren't just science, they predicted omens and the future. The sky map was basically a cosmic GPS for fate. On a more local scale, land surveying was very common and practical. Clay tablets from 2300 BCE detail agricultural plots with notes on boundaries, irrigation canals, and ownership. These were tools for officials, tax collectors, and priests. Accuracy mattered here not for navigation, but for managing wealth and resources. Babylonian maps show a people obsessed with structure, not just physical, but metaphysical. They mapped the world as they understood it, with themselves at the center, surrounded by rivers, enemies, gods, and mysteries. These maps weren't just records, they expressed beliefs, power, and a desire to make the unknowable a little more understandable. While the Babylonians mapped the world with legendary rings and cosmic rivers, the ancient Egyptians focused on something way more down to earth, the land itself. In the Nile floodplain, mapping wasn't abstract anymore. It was about control, survival, and the sacred geometry of a kingdom stretching from desert cliffs to delta marshes. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, didn't map the world like we do today. Instead, their maps were very practical. Every year, the Nile flooded, wiping out farm boundaries. To restore order, surveyors called Harperidon used ropes, measuring sticks, and sights to redraw the grid. This wasn't a one-time ritual. Oh no, it was an annual must-do. Mapping became a state job, tightly controlled by temple scribes and royal officials. The surviving papyrus maps are shockingly accurate. One of the oldest known is the Turin Papyrus map, dating back to around 1160 BC. It's not art or mythology, it's a mining map, showing wadis, hills, gold-rich desert areas, springs, roads, quarry sites, plus hieroglyphic notes marking distances and mineral types. This was a working map for officials and labor crews, not some fancy palace wall decoration. But Egyptian maps weren't totally symbol-free. Temples were often built according to celestial events, and cities were planned with cosmic order in mind. Maps weren't just tools, they were expressions of Ma'at, the Egyptian idea of balance and harmony. Land division and urban planning followed sacred principles. Even pyramids and tombs were aligned with mathematical and astronomical precision. Religious texts also include conceptual maps of the underworld, like those in the Book of the Dead or Amduat. These spiritual maps trace the soul's midnight journey through 12 guarded hours, watched by snakes, gods, and gates, not your GPS, but spiritually significant guides for the departed navigating eternal terrain. Egyptian literature blended bureaucracy and belief, whether surveying a farmer's plot or charting the afterlife. Maps were tools of divine order. Their purpose wasn't just about finding your way on Earth. They ensured alignment with the gods. The Greeks didn't invent maps, but they totally revolutionized how we think about them. For the first time in recorded history, space wasn't just described, it was measured, calculated, and explained. Geography shifted from a practical need to an intellectual pursuit, laying the groundwork for modern geography. Let's talk about Anaximander, a philosopher from Miletus, who supposedly created one of the first conceptual world maps in the 6th century BC, although the original is lost. Many sources describe it as a circular disk with land masses resembling Europe and Asia spread around the Mediterranean center. Sure, it's symbolic, but it also marks a break from mythological worldviews. Anaximander tried to show the physical world in a rational format. Then Hecataeus refined these early ideas, expanding them through travel and research. His map came with a geographic text called periegesis, detailing lands, customs, and peoples. But it was centuries later that Claudius Ptolemy completely changed the game. Ptolemy's geography is a Greek scientific masterpiece. It includes detailed instructions on map making, a list of over 8,000 place names with coordinates, and a latitude-longitude grid system from way before GPS was even a twinkle in anyone's eye. He also introduced projections to display the curved Earth on a flat surface, a challenge that still trips up modern cartographers. Greek maps weren't just practical tools. They were windows into how Greeks saw the world. The oikoumene, the inhabited world, was surrounded by ocean and savage lands, but Greeks placed themselves at the intellectual center. The further from Greece, the more geography got distorted, reflecting both limited knowledge and cultural bias. Interestingly, Greek thinkers wrestled with the idea of a spherical Earth too. Eratosthenes, working in 3rd century BC Alexandria, calculated Earth's circumference using just shadows, geometry, and a stick. He got it, surprisingly close off by only a few hundred miles. Greek cartography was more than drawing lines. Its goal was unlocking Earth's shape, size, and place in the cosmos through math, logic, and ambition. Eratosthenes and his crew in Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE calculated Earth's circumference using just shadows, geometry, and a stick. He nailed it pretty closely, only off by a few hundred miles. Greek writing wasn't just doodling lines. Its purpose was to decode Earth's shape, size, and place in the universe through math, logic, and a whole lot of ambition. The Greeks turned maps from mythology into science, and the world was never the same. If the Greeks gave us the theory of graphics, the Romans gave us the full-on military and logistics application. The Roman Empire wasn't just held together by laws and legions. It was connected into a tight unit thanks to a vast, well-maintained road network. And to keep it running, the Romans whipped up some handy maps and useful maps of the ancient world. Unlike Greek maps that aimed to show the shape of the earth or explore the heavens, Roman maps were all about movement. They were tools for control, expansion, taxes, and supply lines. The heart of it all. All roads lead to Rome. And no, the Romans didn't mean that metaphorically. That was their actual mapping philosophy. Probably the most famous Roman map is the Peutinger Table, a 4th century copy of a much older Roman road map. Geographically, it's a mess by today's standards. Land masses stretched and distorted like crazy. But it nailed its purpose, perfectly showing routes, stops, distances, and connections across the empire from Britain all the way to India. Imagine a modern subway map where spatial accuracy is tossed out the window for the sake of clarity. In short, that's a Roman map. Stops, or estates, are marked at regular intervals with distances in Roman miles. These maps let military commanders, merchants, and messengers travel efficiently over thousands of kilometers. They knew where to swap horses, where to rest, and how long it'd take to reach the next town. This empire moved easily, not just across fields, but on parchment too. Besides road maps, Romans also demanded cadastral maps, super detailed records of land ownership and boundaries, used for taxes and legal disputes. Some were even engraved on bronze and posted in public places so everyone knew exactly who owned what. Land control was power, and the Romans totally got that. Interestingly, they cared less about mapping the entire earth or the sky. They focused on what they could conquer, move through, or tax. Maps weren't cosmic visions. They were spreadsheets with roads. Still, by making the empire legible, Roman maps created something lasting, a shared sense of space, a feeling of belonging to something bigger than your village or tribe. It was the empire's graphic art, functional, detailed, and ruthlessly efficient. While Roman maps stressed roads and administration, ancient Chinese maps aimed for harmony between territory, governance, and the cosmos. In China, maps weren't just geography tools, they were political documents, philosophical statements, and celestial mirrors. Mapping land was about understanding your place under heaven and ruling it properly. Some of the earliest known Chinese maps date back to the 4th century BCE, found in tombs like the one at Mawangdui. These silk maps showed rivers, roads, and military positions not to scale, but incredibly detailed for their time. They weren't made for tourists. They were buried with the dead, maybe to guide the soul or prove the deceased's land claims. By the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE to 220 CE. Writing had matured. Officials used maps to manage vast provinces, record tax zones, and plan military campaigns. Survey tools like the Groma and sighting devices helped measure land with surprising precision. Some handheld maps even included coordinate grids centuries before they appeared in the West. One of China's most influential geographers was Pei Shu. Active in the 3rd century CE, he set principles for scientific mapping, stressing scale, direction, and consistent measurement. His ideas became the foundation for mapping traditions in China and Korea later on. His work was so respected, he's dubbed the father of Chinese cartography. But Chinese maps weren't just about Earth. Cosmological charts held deep significance. The Chinese sky was depicted with constellations grouped into, ended up laying the groundwork for the later map-making traditions of China and Korea. His work was so revered that he earned the title of the father of Chinese cartography. But Chinese maps weren't just about Earth. Their cosmological charts held deep significance. The Chinese sky was mapped out, with constellations grouped into celestial palaces and symbolic animals, like the blue dragon in the east, the white tiger in the west, and so on. These star maps guided everything from farming to royal ceremonies. The emperor was believed to be the son of heaven, ruling according to celestial order. If his maps and his rule fell out of sync, well, so did his reign. In China, maps weren't just boring government tools. They were the bridge between heaven and earth. whether carved, whether carved in stone, painted on silk, or etched in bronze. Maps weren't just about land. They showed the emperors' skill at turning world chaos into clarity. Unlike the huge empires of Eurasia, the Polynesians cooked up one of the most unique and abstract world mapping styles. No paper, no ink, no scale, just deep experience and visual memory. This is a Marshall Islands map, and it's all about a totally different geography, not land, but the ocean. Polynesians were master sailors thousands of years before Europeans dared cross the Atlantic. These guys were navigating vast Pacific waters, using stars, waves, bird behavior, and cloud patterns. No compass, no written language, so their maps had to work differently. Not static images, but memory aids and tactile guides for newbie sailors. Their stick charts were made from thin coconut leaves or wooden rods tied together. Curves showed wave patterns expected in open water, tiny shells or knots marked islands. The layout recorded how waves bent and overlapped. This knowledge let sailors read the ocean like a road map. Different charts served different purposes. Rebel factions' charts covered whole island groups. Grassland groups' charts focused on smaller areas or specific trips. Then there's Matang, abstract teaching tools explaining wave behavior near islands. These babies weren't travel companions. Instead, they were studied, memorized, and internalized. A skilled navigator could cross hundreds of miles, relying just on their senses and what they'd learned from the charts. To outsiders, these maps looked like broken ladders or art installations, but to Polynesian wayfinders, they were deep ecological knowledge, built not on conquest or geometry, but on respect and close ties with nature. Polynesian record-keeping challenged Western ideas that maps must be literal and visual. Their maps were physical, experiential, and often invisible in motion. The issue wasn't recording space. It was feeling it, in many ways. These charts blurred the line between science and spirituality, passed down orally, protected by maritime schools, and treated as sacred. These maps helped Polynesians navigate an ocean that could swallow even the bravest sailors, not just over water, but through memory, rhythm, and ancestral wisdom. As the ancient world gave way to the Middle Ages, maps shifted from scientific observation to symbolic interpretation. Especially in Europe, mapmaking started focusing more on spiritual truth than physical accuracy. The result, maps full of monsters, heavens, demons, and a worldview where geography's center was often the center of belief. One of the most iconic medieval maps was the TO map, dominating European thinking from early Middle Ages to Renaissance. These maps showed the world as a circle, the letter O split into three parts by a T, Asia on top, Europe bottom left, Africa bottom right. Jerusalem usually sat smack dab in the middle, reinforcing the religious heart of the known world. East was on top, not north, because it was believed to be the Garden of Eden's location. These maps weren't for navigation. They were theological tools, reinforcing Christian cosmology, where world geography matched biblical history. Lands were labeled after Noah's sons, and unnamed borderlands housed Jerusalem usually sat smack in the center, reinforcing its role as the religious heart of the known world. East was often placed at the top, not north, because that's where the Garden of Eden was believed to be. These maps weren't about navigation, they were theological tools. Backing up the Christian worldview where the world's geography fit biblical history, lands were labeled after Noah's sons, and the unknown edges were home to weird races, dog-headed folks, umbrella-footed people, or faces on their chests. The further from Jerusalem, the stranger it got. But not every medieval map was pure symbolism. Some preferred the 12th century Rogerian map by Arab geographer al-Idrisi, blending real observations with artistic flair, commissioned by a Norman king in Sicily. This massive silver map was built from interviews with. It's way more detailed and realistic than the European versions floating around at the time. Oh, and heads up south is at the top, because flipping maps upside down was apparently a thing in Islamic texts. Meanwhile, Jewish, Indian, and Buddhist traditions whipped up world maps that were more about concepts than directions. Take Mount Meru, for example, seen as the cosmic axis in many Indian and Tibetan maps, surrounded by symbolic continents and heavenly realms. These medieval maps remind us that mapping isn't just about pinning locations. It's about what people think the world means. Back when horizons were still scary, unknowns, maps weren't just guides. They were mirrors reflecting the soul. As the world got bigger in people's heads, so did our urge to claim it, not just to get from point A to B, but to figure out who we are, where we came from, and what's around us. Those old maps, with all their mistakes, distortions, and weird symbols, laid the groundwork for the modern obsession with space, borders, and precision. What ties all these ancient maps together isn't accuracy, but purpose. Babylonian stone tablets weren't meant to help you find your way. They showed the spiritual structure of the universe. Egyptian maps helped tax collectors and priests keep sacred order in a flood-prone, God-ruled land. Greek maps introduced scale, geometry, and the bold idea that the world could actually be measured. Roman road maps tied a massive empire together, smoothing the way for legions, messengers, and merchants. Chinese maps blended astronomy with governance, always aiming to reflect harmony between heaven and the earth. Then there are the exceptions. Polynesian stick charts, tactile and abstract, prove maps don't always need to be seen. Some are meant to be felt and remembered, and medieval religious maps, with their monsters and paradises, didn't just show where the world was, but what it meant. Even the layers in these ancient maps carry useful info. They reveal what mattered to a culture, what was central, what scared them, what was sacred. These maps remind us geography is never neutral. It reflects priorities, power, myths, and memories. Greeks put themselves in the center. So did the Chinese. So did the Europeans. Everyone's the star of their own world. Today, with satellite images and digital precision down to the meter, we can map the planet like pros, but the core drive behind map-making hasn't budged in thousands of years. Humans need to find themselves in something bigger than themselves. The core motivation behind graphic art hasn't changed in thousands of years. Humans need to find their place in something bigger than themselves. Whether it's papyrus scrolls, clay tablets, or a glowing phone screen, every map answers the same ancient question: where am I?